All right, so we're diving into some pretty deep waters today, huh?
Yeah.
The gun control debate. It's one of those topics that everyone's got an opinion on, but how often do we really try to understand both sides?
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so important. It's not about declaring a winner or telling anyone what to think. It's about unpacking a complex issue that's often dominated by emotion and heated rhetoric.
Exactly. We're all about digging into the nuances here, looking at the historical context, the key arguments from both sides, and yeah, maybe even uncovering some surprising stats along the way. Because let's be honest, sometimes those raw numbers tell a very different story than the headlines.
They absolutely do. And it's about understanding how those numbers connect to broader historical and societal trends. We can't just look at statistics in isolation. We have to consider the bigger picture.
Totally. It's not just about laws on a page, it's about understanding how we got here as a society and where we might go next. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's set the stage a bit. We've essentially got two main camps in this debate, each with a fundamentally different view on guns and their place in society.
Right. On one side, you have the pro-gun control advocates.
Yeah.
Their primary focus is public safety. They'll point to countries like Japan, for example. Getting a firearm there, incredibly difficult. Rigorous background checks, mental health evaluations, even interviews with family members. And guess what? Their rates of gun violence are incredibly low.
See, that's what I mean about those eye-opening stats. It really makes you wonder, are there lessons to be learned from other parts of the world? But I imagine the other side, the pro-gun rights advocates, have a very different take on all of this.
Oh, absolutely. For them, it all comes back to the Second Amendment. They see it as this guarantee of individual liberty, an essential safeguard against tyranny. They argue that owning a firearm is a deterrent to crime, that it makes individuals less vulnerable.
It's like that classic saying, right? An armed society is a polite society. But something tells me it's probably not quite as simple as that for either side.
Not even close.
Yeah.
The pro-gun rights argument goes even deeper. They often express a profound distrust of government overreach. Any restriction on gun ownership, even those framed as, common sense measures, are seen as a slippery slope towards eventual confiscation.
And they often point to Australia as a prime example of that. After that horrible mass shooting in 1996, the Australian government implemented a mandatory buyback program, collecting and destroying over 600,000 firearms. It's a controversial example for sure. Pro-gun rights advocates see it as a blatant infringement on individual liberties, while pro-gun control supporters often highlight the subsequent decrease in gun violence.
So that's where understanding the historical context becomes absolutely crucial. The Second Amendment itself, drafted in a time when militias were considered essential for national defense, is intentionally broad. And that's led to endless debates about its interpretation in a modern context.
So here we are with these two camps, each deeply rooted in their convictions, with this whole weight of history swirling in the background. It's like this giant game of tug of war with deeply held beliefs and complex data points pulling in opposite directions.
Exactly. And it's that tension, that push and pull between individual rights and collective safety that we're going to be trying to unpack in this deep dive.
Okay, I'm hooked. Let's get into it. So we've laid out the two sides, but where do we even begin to untangle this knot?
Well, it gets really interesting when we look at the arguments themselves. And maybe the most obvious battleground is public safety.
Right, because at the end of the day, isn't that what it all boils down to? Keeping people safe.
Exactly. And that's where pro-gun control folks will often hit you with the statistics.
Oh, yeah. The U.S. has well, it's got a bit of a reputation when it comes to gun violence, doesn't it?
It does. And those advocating for stricter gun laws, they'll point to that. They'll say, look, stricter background checks, limiting certain types of weapons, it could significantly bring down gun-related deaths, both homicides, suicides, the whole 9 yards.
And they've got examples, right? Like, haven't there been laws passed that seemed like they were working?
Right. You're thinking of the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act back in '93. Mandated background checks on purchases from licensed dealers.
That's the one. Did that actually make a difference, though?
It's tough to say for sure. Studies are kind of all over the place. Some suggest it might have helped lower firearm homicides, but
What?
pro-gun rights groups, they'll argue it just puts hurdles in front of law-abiding citizens. Criminals, they'll get their hands on guns regardless of some law.
That's always the counter-argument, isn't it? If someone's determined to do something illegal, will a law actually stop them?
It's a good question, really gets to the heart of it. They'll point to places like Chicago, strict gun laws, but still, the violence continues.
So their argument is, those laws only impact the people who were never the problem in the first place.
Pretty much. But then on the flip side, You've got pro-control folks saying, hold on, look at California, New York, stricter laws, generally lower gun violence.
So who's right? It's like apples and oranges, right?
It's more like apples, oranges, and I don't know, well, a fruit salad of other factors. You start comparing states, you got to look at everything. Cultural attitudes about guns, urban versus rural, economics.
So even if a law is on the books, how it actually plays out in the real world, that's a whole other can of worms.
Exactly. And then, of course, you bring in mass shootings, which always kicks everything up a notch.
Yeah, that's when the debate really explodes, doesn't it?
It does. Restricting high-capacity magazines, certain types of rifles, pro-gun control folks say that could make a difference.
They'll bring up that assault weapons ban from the 90s, right?
They will say it had an impact. But then the other side will argue, nope, didn't change a thing, just targeted certain guns that looked scary, not even based on how they actually worked.
So every fact, every number, it's like both sides can spin it to fit their narrative.
That's what happens when you've got deeply held beliefs. You tend to look for information that backs up what you already think, rather than being open to the other side.
It's like a tug of war where nobody's really winning, just pulling back and forth.
And in the middle of all that, we sometimes forget that behind all the statistics, there are real people with very personal reasons for feeling so strongly about this issue.
It's easy to get lost in all the data and the arguments, you know? It starts to feel like, I don't know, like this giant maze with no way out. But amidst all that back and forth, is there even any hope of finding some middle ground?
You'd be surprised. It's easy to think this whole gun control debate is just two sides yelling at each other, but there are actually some points where they kind of converge.
Okay, now that's what I like to hear. Because it's easy to get bogged down in the disagreements and forget that progress is even possible.
Absolutely. And one of those surprise areas of agreement is actually background checks.
Yeah.
Even a lot of strong Second Amendment folks, they don't want criminals or, dangerous individuals getting hold of guns either.
Makes sense, right? Keep guns out of the hands of those who shouldn't have them. It's about finding that balance, isn't it? Protecting rights, but also keeping people safe.
Exactly. And that's where the conversation shifts, right? It's less about should we do background checks and more like, okay, but how do we actually make that work?
So instead of arguing over whether the door should be open or closed, it's more like, how do we build a good door in the first place?
That's a great way to put it. Because then you get into the nitty-gritty, universal background checks, but what about private sales? Gun shows, it gets complicated fast, even if you agree on the general idea.
It's like we all agree the destination's important, but figuring out the best way to get there, that's where the real work is.
Totally. And speaking of complexities, there's this whole other layer we haven't even touched on yet, which is mental health.
You're right. We've been so focused on the laws and the stats, we forgot about the human side of things.
And that's often where you see common ground emerge again. Both sides will usually agree that mental health plays a huge role in gun violence, especially when we're talking about things like suicide.
Makes you think, instead of just arguing about the tool, shouldn't we be putting more effort into understanding the underlying reasons, the root causes?
Exactly. And that opens up a whole new avenue for discussion. What if we put more resources into mental health care, early intervention, destigmatizing, seeking help? Could that make a real difference? It's complicated, but it's a conversation worth having.
Because maybe the solution isn't just about laws, right? Maybe it's about creating a society where people feel supported, where they have other options besides reaching for a gun.
Right. Addressing things like poverty, inequality, teaching conflict resolution. It's about recognizing that gun violence, it's often a symptom of deeper issues.
This whole deep dive, it's really been something else. We started with the Second Amendment, dug through statistics, and now we're talking about mental health and building a better society. It's a lot.
It is. And I think the biggest takeaway is that there are no easy answers here. This isn't a problem with a simple solution, no magic wand we can wave.
But maybe that's okay. Maybe the first step is just acknowledging that complexity. Because if we're being honest, trying to oversimplify things, that's what leads to all the shouting matches in the echo chamber.
Couldn't agree more. Being willing to listen to each other, to understand different perspectives, even if we disagree, that's how we move forward.
Maybe we won't always agree, but if we can at least start from a place of mutual respect, of genuinely wanting to understand each other's viewpoints, well, maybe then we can actually start making some progress, right?
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe this deep dive will inspire some folks out there to do a little digging of their own. Because the more informed we all are, the better equipped we are to have these tough conversations.
And that's what it's all about, right? Learning, growing, and hopefully building a safer, more understanding world together. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everybody. Until next time.